I am absolutely fascinated by members in my audience that can tell me that they can track their heritage back 500, 600, even 700 years. That blows my mind. Which is why I'm really happy to say that today's video is sponsored by MyHeritage. MyHeritage is a leading global service that allows one to look deep into the history of one's family. It has over 90 million users and 18 billion, that's with a B, searchable historical records. I started using this not that long ago, and it is so easy to create your own family tree. And that's really where the magic happens, because the program can then find information about your ancestors. If you do the same, perhaps you will also find some fascinating stories of what your ancestors did. And here's the best part. It comes with AI tech to repair, enhance, colorize, and even animate photos. I mean, you might be able to even walk away from this experience with pictures that you can frame. Because of this program, I was able to find a really great photo of my grandfather. Pretty handsome guy, huh? Then, with a few clicks, I enhanced the picture, removed damages, and then even added an animation. It has been a really long time since I've seen my grandfather smile. Sign up today for a 14-day free trial and enjoy all the amazing features that MyHeritage has to offer, which even includes a very convenient way to get DNA kits. If you decide to continue your subscription, just click the link below and you'll get a 50% discount. So what are you waiting for? Begin your journey into your own heritage today. On the battlefield of Shiloh, there is a pond. It's a very tiny body of water. It actually took me a while to find it. You can actually see it at street level on Google Earth. There are people that have taken pictures and have uploaded them. Now, for those that know the history of this place, it can be somewhat hard to look away from these pictures. There is a profound sadness to it, almost an eeriness. Now, I'm not big into the paranormal, but I would not want to be here at night. In the spring of 1862, this very pond was where scores of men dragged themselves to. They were heavily wounded. They inched their way to the water with their shattered and bleeding bodies, some of them to take their very last drink. Their blood, so copious in volume, had already saturated the ground and then mixed with the water, giving it its name, the Bloody Pond. The Bloody Pond is not alone. There are numerous spots on this battlefield where men died en masse, in some places not by the hundreds, but by the thousands. The Battle of Shiloh changed the way Americans saw their Civil War. The results were horrendous. In 2 days near the banks of the Tennessee River, there were more American casualties than in the Revolutionary War, the War of 1812, and the Mexican-American War put together. 2 days. Up until this point, people figured that the American Civil War would be decided with one major confrontation. Thus, they clamored to get enlisted. They didn't want to miss out on that fight. After this, it began to dawn on people that this was going to be a grueling, drawn-out, exhausting conflict. This episode of The Art of War is about the Battle of Shiloh, and while it highlights the lesson of a well-timed counterattack, you simply cannot tell the story well unless you bring in all the destruction that it brought. In 1861, the American Civil War broke out. As the legendary historian Shelby Foote would say, it was because we failed to do the thing we really have a genius for, which is compromise. When Abraham Lincoln won the 1860 election, it pushed many southern states, starting with South Carolina, to secede from the Union. The flashpoint for war itself began in Charleston, South Carolina, where shore batteries opened up against Fort Sumter on April 12, 1861. In one of those ironies of war, the man who commanded the shore batteries was P.G.T. Beauregard, who was considered one of the finest artillery officers that West Point had produced. His teacher, his mentor, the guy who taught him everything, was Robert Anderson, who just happened to be the commander of Fort Sumter. That is, the guy that Beauregard was now shooting at. Union forces in the fort, which was located in the middle of the harbor, managed to last for 34 hours, eventually surrendering the next day on April 13th. The only casualty was a horse. A few days later, on April 15th, President Lincoln asked for 75,000 volunteers for the armies of the Republic. The Confederacy also raced to mobilize. Now, there was no turning back. The American Civil War was going to be one of the first major confrontations of the Industrial Age. It wasn't going to be about a single commander with a single army winning an entire war with a victory in a single battle. Instead, it would be about a nation's industrial output, producing and supplying major armies, plural, on a variety of fronts. This was a war where technological advancements would be crucial, and I'm not talking about just weapons development, but advances in communication like the telegraph, in naval warfare like with steamships controlling major rivers and the development of the ironclads. Not to mention railroads being a key factor not just in logistics but also in troop deployment. Which brings me to the first major battle, where railroads actually played a significant role. On July 21, 1861, Union and Confederate forces clash just outside of Washington, D.C. It was known as Bull Run by the North. They had a tendency to name their battles after the nearest river. And to the south, it was called Manassas. They named their battles after the nearest city. The preparation for this fight was ludicrous compared to later standards. The troops were green. They had very little training. Some of them didn't even have standardized uniforms. Most of the commanders had very limited battle experience. And a lot of the officers were put into position because they had some sort of political affiliation. The mentality of the non-combatants was also a bit off. You have stories of civilians that are packing picnics to go out and actually watch the fight. Bull Run, or Manassas, depending on what side you're on, turns out to be a major Confederate victory. There's a lot of what-if scenarios out there that states that what if the Confederates decided to press on to Washington, D.C. after this victory? Would they have been able to take it? I actually would like to leave that question up to you. The casualties from this battle come out to just under 5,000, which compared to later fights is going to be a skirmish, but at the time this was horrific. Part of the reason why there were so many casualties at this battle was because the weapons development had outpaced military tactics. There's a military adage that says, generals always fight the last war. So a lot of the commanders were referencing Napoleonic tactics, which at this point were about 50 years old. The idea of amassing men into a single unit and, marching them directly into incoming fire, which I guess made sense during Napoleonic times because the weapon's accuracy was not that great, so you could actually march men within kind of knife-fighting range. By the time of the American Civil War, you had a combination of the rifled musket and the mini-ball, which, despite its name, actually had a conical shape. The accuracy suddenly jumped. 300 yards, you could hit a target about 60% of the time. And at 500 yards, you could have an accuracy as high as 40%. So if you amassed everyone line abreast and had them march into a fixed enemy position that was backed up by artillery, there's a good chance that by the time you closed to 100 yards, there'd be nobody left. The surprising thing to me was that a lot of commanders, both North and South, didn't pick up on this fact even after the war had ended. So after Bull Run, things begin to languish, at least on the Eastern Front. The North retreats to its strongholds and starts to refit its army, and the South doesn't want to lead a war of aggression into Northern territory, at least not yet. Lincoln, at this point, puts in charge of the Army of the Potomac, that is the premier army on the Eastern Theater of Operations, a General George B. McClellan. When it comes to training and organizing the army, this man is excellent. He does an absolutely wonderful job at this, and this is going to pay dividends down the line. But the big problem is that George McClellan does not want to use his army for what it's intended to do. He doesn't want to put his men into harm's way. The man is timid. He doesn't want to move. He doesn't have that aggressive streak that you're going to need if you're going to be in charge of an army. The president gets completely frustrated with the general. And I can completely understand where Lincoln is coming from. I mean, you spent all of this money to create this massive army, and now your general is not doing anything with it. I mean, can you imagine something like this happening in our modern era? Lincoln initially encourages McClellan to get on the move, then he demands it, and then he just outright threatens the guy. And for the record, one of the biggest problems that Abraham Lincoln faced, at least in the initial phases of the American Civil War, was finding a general who had both the capacity and the tenacity to fight in this war, and Lincoln would go through a couple of them. McClellan's response to Lincoln was to take the Army of the Potomac, sail it down to Virginia, and then to advance it up the peninsula that was created between the James and the York rivers. Now, if everything had gone to plan, McClellan's much bigger army would have not only taken the Confederates by surprise, but had he moved fast enough, there is a good chance that he could have taken Richmond, which was the Confederate capital. But instead, he took his time, his very sweet time, which gave the Confederates enough time to muster a very strong defense, and eventually, Robert E. Lee would take command of the army, which he would rename the Army of Northern Virginia. At this point, it really wasn't a contest. Whatever George B. McClellan lacked in military capability, Robert E. Lee had with excess. This Southern general was arguably one of the greatest military minds in history. He was excellent on both the offense and on the defense. He liked to take chances, he was aggressive, and he kind of had to be. In most of his military encounters, he was outnumbered. He also had this ability to understand what his opponent was going to do. It's as Sun Tzu would say, if you know yourself and you know your opponent, you won't be imperiled in 100 battles. Lee assumes command of the Army of Northern Virginia and takes the fight directly to McClellan. Between June 25th and July 1st, 1862, in what would later be known as the 7-Day Battles, which, by the way, Lee actually lost most of these, George B. McClellan was so unnerved by this that he retreated his men down the peninsula and then eventually evacuated the entire Army of the Potomac back to northern soil. For the South, this was a tremendous strategic victory. Now granted, I will give it to you, this did happen after the Battle of Shiloh, but I want to give you an understanding of just how bad things were in the Eastern Theater of Operations. Now, the Western Theater of Operations was a completely different story. While the situation stagnated in the East, the Union armies were definitely Oscar Mike in the West. That means on the move, soldier. When the American Civil War broke out, there were several border states that were indecisive as to kind of where they were going to sit. This included Missouri, Kentucky, Delaware, and Maryland. These states were, in a sense, up for grabs. Kentucky had a governor that wanted to join the Confederacy, but the legislature wanted to stay in the Union. So they compromised and declared neutrality, which completely blows my mind. This is a state in a civil war, not Switzerland. The Confederates would make the first move. In an attempt to control a portion of the Mississippi River, Major General Leonidas Polk occupied the city of Columbus, Kentucky on September 3, 1861. The Union could now claim that they had the moral high ground. They could move in their forces for the purposes of defending Kentucky against Confederate aggression. The Union man on the ground was Brigadier General Ulysses S. Grant. In a sense like Robert E. Lee, Grant also had an aggressive streak. Just 2 days after Leonidas Polk had occupied Columbus, Kentucky, Grant on his own volition moved in and took the city of Paducah. The town would eventually fall on September 6th and would serve as a forward base of operations. Grant was just getting started. In November of 1861, he sailed his men via steamboat down the Mississippi from Cairo, not Cairo, Illinois, and attacked Confederate forces at the Battle of Belmont, though he wasn't able to take Columbus. Now, even though the Battle of Belmont was not that big, it was still a victory, which, in any size, Lincoln would take at this point in the war. Not only did Grant pick up some valuable battle experience, but he also gained a favorable impression to the commander-in-chief. Ulysses S. Grant was already planning his next attack. On February 1st of 1862, he was given authorization by his commanding officer, a Henry Halleck, to advance and take Fort Henry on the Tennessee River, which was one of the major waterways for the Confederacy. Just as a side note, Henry Halleck was the opposite of Grant. He was very cautious in his maneuvers. He favored the idea of a defensive strategy and fixed fortifications. But don't get me wrong, the guy was also really intelligent. He was a scholar, he became a lawyer, he graduated from West Point in 1839. Indeed, Lincoln put him in charge of all armies in the Western Theater of Operations, but his cautious nature would put him at odds with a lot of his subordinates. He and Grant did not get along. That said, once Grant had the green light to move, he moved extremely quickly. On February 2nd, Grant ferried his men up the Tennessee River using his steam gunboats. He loved those gunboats, by the way. Grant had planned a two-pronged attack on Fort Henry. His men would approach from the land, and his gunboats would attack from the river. While Fort Henry was well defended to its landward side, its river batteries had been inundated by high waters from heavy rains, so when Grant's gunboats showed up, they could pummel the fort with impunity. For the Confederates in the fort, this was an untenable position. When the full attack came, it completely overwhelmed the defenders, and on February 6, 1862, the 3,000-man garrison surrendered. The Tennessee River was now controlled by the Union. Seizing the initiative, Grant quickly launched his next attack against Fort Donelson, which was located nearby on the Cumberland River. This was a much more tenacious fight. It lasted several days, and at one point the Confederates even sallied out to attack him. But on February 16th, the defenders of the fort had had enough. Its garrison, which at this point had been reduced to about 12,000 men, asked for terms. Grant simply responded that the only thing he took was unconditional surrender. The Confederates had no other choice but to acquiesce. These two victories made Grant a sensation in the East, albeit Halleck did get a lot of the credit. In the newspapers, it was said of Grant that the first two initials in his name now meant unconditional surrender. Things now for the Confederacy in the Western Theater of Operations were only going to get worse. The Tennessee and the Cumberland Rivers, both major waterways, were now in Union hands, and less than 10 days later, on February 25, 1862, General Don Carlos Buell and his Army of the Ohio took Nashville. Most of western Tennessee was now controlled by federal troops. But it needs to be mentioned that Tennessee was not done. It would continue to be a major battleground state later in the war. However, at this point, it was time for the Union to plan its next offensive. With both Fort Henry and Fort Donelson in Union control, Henry Halleck ordered Ulysses S. Grant and his Army of the Tennessee to move south along the Tennessee River. Don Carlos Buell and his Army of the Ohio was to rendezvous with Grant at Pittsburgh Landing, and then the two armies together were to advance further south. According to some estimates, these two armies combined would have been about 75,000 men. The South, on the other hand, had about 40,000 men with another 15,000 reinforcements moving in, so this combined Union force would have been something very difficult to take out. The main objective that Henry Halleck had in mind was to take the city of Corinth in northern Mississippi. This was a very strategic spot because it was a railroad hub. The two main lines that ran through the city were the Charleston and Memphis Railroad that went from east to west, and the Mobile and Ohio, which went through it from north to south. Now, as I've mentioned before, railroads were extremely important during the American Civil War, not just for being able to move raw resources and supplies back and forth, but also for troop deployment. At the beginning of the war, the South had a fraction of the number of railroad lines that the North had. What's more, most of the railroad lines in the Confederacy would run in a north and south direction, which made them, from a military perspective, not that great. This makes actually more sense if you think about it in terms of all the raw resources of the South being shipped up to northern factories for processing. That is, obviously, before the war broke out. Therefore, any place that had an east-to-west conduit would be prime real estate. Think about it. If the Union was able to sever those east-west lines, it could essentially sever the Confederacy's ability to shuffle troops and supplies from the eastern states to the western states and vice versa. The other thing to keep in mind is that by taking Corinth, that would have been a stepping stone to taking cities like Memphis, Vicksburg, and thus securing the Mississippi River. Just as a side note, the Union was already making plans to take New Orleans at this point. It actually fell on April 25, 1862. So if the Union was able to connect all of those cities together under their control, and I'm talking about places like Columbia, Kentucky, Memphis, Tennessee, Vicksburg, Mississippi, and New Orleans, Louisiana, then they would have had control of the Mississippi and would have effectively cut the Confederacy in two. So this offensive action that Henry Halleck had come up with actually had a lot of potential upside. So, in late February and then March, both the Army of the Tennessee and the Army of the Ohio made preparations and began moving into place. By early April, Grant had positioned his men into two major areas. The larger contingent, with about 45,000 to about 49,000 men, were positioned at Pittsburgh Landing. Another, with about 8,500, was located a bit to the north at Crump's Landing. He was instructed not to advance any further until Buell had arrived to reinforce him from Nashville. So Grant set up his headquarters in Savannah, Tennessee, just about 9 miles to the northeast of Pittsburgh Landing. On April 2, 1862, the Confederate General Sidney Johnston, commanding about 45,000 men, based in Corinth, Mississippi, learned that the two Federal armies were separated. General Johnston was an impressive commander. We'll get more in depth on him in a bit. He knew that he had an opportunity here. If he could strike the divided Union forces, then he had the potential to knock them out in piecemeal. On the 3rd of April, Johnston commanded his 4 corps to advance rapidly on Pittsburgh Landing, a distance of approximately 15 to 20 miles. However, the roads between Corinth, Mississippi and Pittsburgh Landing, Tennessee were bad at baseline, and heavy spring rains had turned them into mud. Thus, the Confederate Army didn't arrive into position to attack until the very early morning of April 6th. But to the credit of the Confederate commander, he did manage to bring the entire army within 1 mile of the Federal line. And keep this in mind, Grant was later going to be heavily criticized for not being able to pick up on this incoming army. Indeed, when his troops spotted Confederate cavalry, most of that information was simply ignored. In fact, at one point, William Tecumseh Sherman, one of Grant's subcommanders, actually went so far as to arrest one of his sergeants for spreading, quote, false rumors of an impending attack. Therefore, on the morning of April 6, 1862, Confederate General Sidney Johnston had achieved complete surprise. The fighting began at 5 a.m. between two skirmishing forces, and it didn't let up. In fact, it only intensified. Johnston, seeing this, ordered a full-on attack with all of his forces at 5:30 a.m. He was now officially all in. He rode to the front to command his troops personally and placed his second-in-command, P.G.T. Beauregard, if you recall the hero of Fort Sumter and Bull Run, to coordinate the incoming supplies and reinforcements. Some argue that this was a tactical mistake on his part. Being at the front deprived him of coordinating the overall command, and essentially gave that to Beauregard, and this became readily evident. Johnston's overall plan was to hit the Union left, driving it away from Pittsburgh Landing and cutting it off from its supply. But it was the Union right that was the first to come under attack. William Tecumseh Sherman had his division deployed near Shiloh Church, which came under attack by General Hardee's and General Polk's corps. They were massively outnumbered. At first, Sherman refused to believe that this was a major attack. It wasn't until his orderly was killed right next to him and he was shot in the hand that he decided that he needed to get more serious. Nobody had been expecting an attack, and so no fortifications or entrenchments were put up. What's worse, most of Sherman's men were green, and some of them just fled. But others began to put up a fierce resistance. The fighting around Shiloh Church grew extremely intense. That said, at least for the first few hours, Sherman's division, supported by McClernand's division on his left, were able to hold the line. Grant at this time heard the shooting from his base in Savannah. At 7:30, he boarded his headquarters steamship, the Tigress, in order to cross the river. He arrived at approximately 8:30 a.m. at Pittsburgh Landing, and he knew he was now in a huge fight. Immediately, he sent out orders to Lew Wallace's division at Crump's Landing and William Nelson's division, which was actually a part of Buell's army at Savannah, to move up quickly and reinforce his line. However, it needs to be pointed out that due to miscommunication, Nelson would not arrive until later that evening, and Lew Wallace took the wrong road and would have dangerously appeared all alone in the Confederate rear, where he most likely would have been destroyed. After rerouting his force, it would take him until nightfall to reach Grant. By 8:45 a.m., Sherman's position at Shiloh Church was no longer tenable. His left flank was being turned and he was forced to withdraw. Many of his men were in panic. McClernand was in the same position. By 10 a.m., the two commanders had fallen back to the Hamburg-Purdy Road, abandoning their camps in the process. The Confederates stopped to raid the camps, taking anything that wasn't nailed down and eating meals that were still warm. Organization in the Confederate line completely broke down, delaying the advance. Confederate commanders seeing this breakdown quickly arrived at the front to reorganize their men, and by 11 a.m. they were ready to renew the attack. On the westernmost aspect of the battlefield, P.G.T. Beauregard had Hardee commanding the left, Polk in the center, and Bragg on the right. He then threw this tsunami of men against Sherman and McClernand, who were driven back to Jones's Field, a mere mile and a half to Pittsburgh Landing. But as they were pushed back, the Union troops could shorten their lines, make them stronger, and supply them more easily. Sherman was actually able to counterattack, which took the Confederates by surprise. Johnston, in response, sent in his last reserve to stabilize the situation. Then, for the next 4 hours, savage fighting for this portion of the battle occurred. Both sides took horrendous losses. While the Federal right flank is being devastated, the center, defended by a division under Prentiss, also comes under attack. The onslaught was too much. General Prentiss and his men gave way, some of them didn't stop running. General Johnston, seeing his opponent's center falling back, now follows up on this by making a concentrated attack on the Union left flank. If you recall, this was his plan all along. At 11 a.m., portions of Bragg's corps are ordered into the fray, and by noon, Johnston reinforces this attack by sending in Breckinridge's corps as well. The Confederates slam into what is left of Prentiss's division, and then begin to fight with the divisions of Wallace and Hurlbut. Johnston's men pushed the Union forces back along the Hamburg-Savannah Road, but by 2 p.m., after 3 hours of intense fighting at a place called the Peach Orchard, now fully in bloom, the Union begins to hold and the Confederate attack stalls. Just next to the Peach Orchard lies the Bloody Pond, where those that were wounded crawl to get water, some to drink for the very last time. It was during this advance that Albert Sidney Johnston, directing his men personally at the front, gets shot in the leg. But here's the thing, he doesn't notice it. He's got an old wound in his leg that has kind of numbed it. He begins to bleed, and by 2:45, his wound proved to be mortal. Johnston dies, becoming the highest-ranking officer of the war on either side to die on the battlefield. Ironically, just before he got shot, he had sent his surgeon away to tend to wounded Union soldiers. I've also heard that even more ironically, he died with a tourniquet in his pocket, something he could have used to stop the bleeding. His death was going to be a devastating one, and not just at the Battle of Shiloh, but to the Confederacy as a whole. Johnston was an exceptional military commander. He was a West Point grad, class of 1826, veteran of the Texas War of Independence, the Mexican-American War, and he had even fought in other campaigns prior to 1861. So when the American Civil War broke out, he came to it with a lot of experience. He was a very good friend to Jefferson Davis, the President of the Confederacy. In September of 1861, he was appointed General of the Western Armies, which effectively made him the second highest-ranking general in the CSA. He knew how to fight. Jefferson Davis would later say of him, "When Sidney Johnston fell, it was the turning point of our fate, for we had no other to take up his work in the West." To the credit of Johnston's men, after he fell at Shiloh, his men continued to fight. PGT Beauregard would now take command and press the offensive. By 4 p.m., Ulysses S. Grant was in a very difficult position. His right flank under Sherman and McClernand had taken significant losses. His left flank under Hurlbut had likewise been devastated. What's more, his reinforcements were nowhere to be seen on the battlefield. He ordered his entire line to fall back to a much stronger defensive position covering a high ridge, with Pittsburgh Landing and the Tennessee River literally at his back. It was an act of desperation. It was his last line of defense. Grant orders this line to be heavily entrenched, and most of his men are able to fall back in relatively good order. This move, while desperate, also had the advantages of shortening the line that Grant had to defend, improving his interior lines, and it brought him closer to his supply. Now, while his flanks were able to fall back, Grant's center was a completely different story. Components of Prentiss and W.H.L. Wallace's division find a strong defensive position in a thick wood overlooking a sunken road. They dig in and hold on tenaciously, 6,200 men supported by 25 cannon. The gunfire in this area becomes so intense that the whizzing of the countless mini-balls sound like angry hornets to the soldiers, which gives this place its name, the Hornet's Nest. Now, with Grant's two flanks withdrawing, the Hornet's Nest becomes isolated and eventually it is completely surrounded by the Confederate Army. The stubborn defense frustrates the Southern troops, but they don't let up either. They attack with everything they got, and by 5:30 p.m., they overwhelm the defenders. Prentiss and 2,000 Union soldiers surrender. Wallace is shot dead. Tactically, it can be argued that this was a mistake. PGT Beauregard should have pushed on to Grant's last line of defense and bypassed the Hornet's Nest altogether. But by attacking it, Grant is given precious time that he needs to reinforce his line and reorganize his men. The Federal commander even goes so far as to bring up his gunboats along the Tennessee River in order to shell the Confederate right. After the Hornet's Nest fell, organization in the Confederate Army was nearly non-existent. Southern troops at this point were exhausted and running low on supplies. By the time they got to Grant's line at approximately 6 p.m., there was very little that they could do to press the offensive as a unified effort. That said, about 6,000 Confederates did manage to assault the Union left flank, but were simply mowed down by Union troops that were holding the fortified high ground. By 6:30 p.m., darkness finally came to the battlefield. Fighting had been going on now for over 13 hours. Both sides, completely exhausted, bedded down for the night, but sleep was going to be something hard to come by. A harsh, cold rain drenched the field, and Grant had two of his gunboats, the USS Lexington and the USS Tyler, shell the Confederate position well into the night. That evening, PGT Beauregard sent a message to Richmond declaring victory, stating that in the morning all he'd have to do is a mop-up operation. Later that night, on the other side of the battlefield, William Tecumseh Sherman came up to Grant and said, "Well, Grant, we've had the devil's own day, haven't we?" Grant would respond, "Yes, lick 'em tomorrow, though." Grant was an interesting man. He was the son of a tanner in Illinois. It was said that he never wanted to pursue his father's profession as he hated the sight of blood. Growing up, he was an avid reader with a curious intellect for many fields. He went to West Point and graduated in the middle of his class in 1843. On paper, you wouldn't have thought that he was really destined for very much. However, during the Mexican-American War, he served with distinction. He was then only Lieutenant U.S. Grant. Ironically, it was during this war that he fought alongside men like Sidney Johnston, Jefferson Davis, and a captain with the name Robert E. Lee. Outside of war, he was not so successful, failing as a businessman and then as a farmer. At one point, he was nearly bankrupt. In 1861, when war broke out, he signed up as soon as he could, and by November of that year, he made a reputation for himself as someone who would bring the fight to the enemy. Grant would now have a chance to prove that exact point. During the night of April 6th to 7th, reinforcements began to pour in. Lew Wallace's division arrived along with William Nelson's division. Steamships brought in Buell's army at 20,000, who deployed on Grant's left flank. The Federal Army was now estimated to be between 45 to 50,000 strong, of which nearly half were fresh. The Confederates, at most, would have had about 28,000, and during the night, they were poorly organized. P.G.T. Beauregard decided to set up his headquarters near Shiloh Church and was alerted by the cavalry commander, Nathan Bedford Forrest, of some of the incoming Federal reinforcements. But he didn't do much with that information, and he was still not aware that Buell had even arrived. The Confederate commander figured the next day he could still launch an attack at his leisure and crush Grant. Grant was not going to give him that satisfaction. At 6 a.m. on April 7th, Grant took the initiative and unleashed his entire army from the high ground surrounding Pittsburgh Landing. It was now time for the Confederates to be taken by surprise, and they quickly fell back. Beauregard quickly arrived at the front and hastily reorganized his men. At 11 a.m., with renewed vigor, he launched a counterattack around Shiloh Church that stalled the Federal advance. Southern troops fought back aggressively, holding Grant's men in place for 2 hours at the Hamburg-Purdy Road. However, as the day wore on, the weight of numbers began to take hold and casualties mounted. Beauregard realized that not only was he heavily outnumbered, but that his army was getting close to collapse. At 2 p.m., with limited options, and in an attempt to preserve what was left of his army, Beauregard ordered a full-on retreat. His men began to fall back to Corinth. Shiloh is a Hebrew word which, by some interpretations, means place of peace. The battlefield of Shiloh was anything but that. It came close to being a Union disaster, but with a well-timed counterattack and prompt arrival of reinforcements, it became a victory. The casualties shocked the nation. The numbers were estimated to be about 13,000 Union and nearly 10,700 Confederate. Anyone who felt this was going to be a short war now began to question that belief. This included, by the way, Ulysses S. Grant. Many began to realize that with this tenacity, bringing down the Confederacy would be a war of complete subjugation. In the aftermath, Grant came under intense scrutiny, and some of the questions that were asked were spot on. Why did he not have any form of reconnaissance? Why were there no patrols? Why were the forward positions not fortified? And when he was notified that there were enemy troops in the vicinity, why didn't he do anything with that information? Some newspapers went so far as to accuse Grant of having been drunk during the entire affair. There was a major outcry to Abraham Lincoln to have him removed, but Lincoln's response was characteristically simple yet eloquent. "I cannot spare this man. He fights." With this victory at Shiloh, the Union would have the capacity to move further south. In time, Vicksburg would be taken, and the Confederacy would be cut in two. But what if things had gone just a little differently? Here, my dear audience, are my questions to you. What would have happened if Buell didn't arrive that night? What would Grant have done? Had Shiloh been a Confederate victory, how would that have affected the Union strategy as a whole? After all, there really wasn't much left in the Western theater of operations. The Midwestern cities would have been completely exposed. And if Lincoln would have had to transfer troops from the East to support this theater, would that have made Robert E. Lee unstoppable when he invaded the North in 1863?